My dear, I'm so glad to be here. And I have to tell you that I think you were on mute
No way.
this way. And all I could think of was I was doing this in the back room, but of course you couldn't see me. So all I was thinking was, this is great because we're talking about people with different abilities and capacities. And what if we can't hear? Look at the incredible beauty and passion and conviction and purpose that you have in your work that was still conveyed.
All right then. So then you know what, Miss Judith-Kate, you are going to sit through take 2
I'm ready.
because you guys should not and cannot miss this introduction. Well, as you've seen, this is Judith-Kate Friedman. Now before I start, can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, I can. I don't know if you've got other people in your chat saying anything in the comments. Yeah.
But Judith-Kate Friedman is a multi-model artist who lives, works, and plays at the crossroads where arts, activism, ritual, and oral tradition dance. Originally from New York City, Brooklyn, Lower East Side, she's lived on the West Coast of the US for about 35 years. Judith-Kate founded and directs Songwriting Works Educational Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization that works to restore joy and hope and vitality and community to elders, families, and care partners across the continuum of cognitive, physical, and emotional realities through song and story. She is also the steward of the Myth Singer Legacy Project, carrying on the work and vision of myth singer Daniel Deardorff to restore the power of myth to culture and community. Now, Judith-Kate, who is here with us tonight, is a beloved partner, a life partner, a love partner, and a collaboration partner with Daniel for nearly 14 years, if not more. And she is honored to follow in his lineage as a myth teller and in the lineage of her Eastern European Jewish Ashkenazi ancestors as she creates and curates and improvs and celebrates the songs, stories, dance, poetry, spoken word, and media arts. But before we start our talk, I think it's important for you guys to know a little bit about Daniel himself. It just so happens that today is Daniel's birthday. He is a myth singer. He is a storyteller, a ritualist, a composer, and a producer. He's a polio survivor and early teacher about otherness. He toured extensively with renowned soft rock band Seals and Crofts for 10 years and produced award-winning albums for other artists. After his polio recovery, this is when Deardorff wrote his book, The Other Within. The Genius of Deformity in Myth, Culture, and Psyche. And it was published over 13 years ago in November. It's a mouthful, but this is one of those things that it's worth telling all of it. I know you mentioned in the email, take what you want and leave the rest, but I think all of the biographies were necessary to talk about in their fullest. And, before we get into tonight's talk, I'm going to once again show the book and let, the viewer know that this is worth the purchase. It's worth the read. If you have ever considered yourself as someone who has been othered by your friends, family, community, because of your culture, your skin color, your language, your religion, your invisible or visible disabilities, whatever it is, this is the live you want to sit through and listen to. So Judith-Kate, you are here, and I want to say thank you so much for saying yes to me for this interview.
Of course. I feel very honored, and it's been really lovely to start getting to know you and to now connect with your audience and with all of the beautiful things that truly the magical solution. I've been thinking about what that can mean in all of its many layers. And one way is the arts, right? And it's just sort of like one part of how an art and spirit are not separate in many, many, many cultures. There's not even different words for those things. In ours, they're very split a lot of times, but the way we live and the way that Danny thought about myth and ritual as being in and of themselves together, they went together. It was a ritual when we would have myth. It is the myth comes in the context of creating a space that is sacred. That like those things are together. So I do want to add one thing to his bio before we go forward.
Yes, please.
So that word in his bio that is sometimes hard to get, it's post-polio sequelae. I had no idea how to pronounce it. But what happened was when he turned 40, he survived polio. He had it at 17 months. And, there's been years and years where we've had, thankfully, a vaccine for it. But the post-polio is what happens to people who had polio, did well, with whatever ways they could, in terms of they did well if they survived, right? I mean, what does well mean? We can get into that. But regardless of how much function they may have been able to get back if they had polio severely, which he did, the body will start, the nerves inside that were damaged, they grow secondary growth. It's like a heart that grows a corollary artery. It's just like, I'm going to make my own bypass. The body wants to live. It moves forward.
Right.
But then what happens is those nerves start receding. And so a lot of people who were able to walk for years, maybe decades, they stopped being able to function as well. For Danny, he was never able to walk after he had polio. So he was a lifelong wheelchair user. But the way that the post-polio hit made him have to retire from the music business. So I just want to say that is when he went into his third career, not a performer songwriter, though he did that again later in his late years, not the record producer, not working long hours in the studio, but getting deep into myth and the power in these old stories, and then teaching with Robert Bly and others. So
and of course, creating this Myth Singer project. So what is the Myth Singer project that he created and that you're continuing forward?
So he created something he called the Myth Singer Foundation and the Myth Singer Consortium. He wanted to bring everyone who was interested in restoring the power of myth back into culture. Across all cultures, across the world, across generations, he wanted to just get a lot of people who were doing this. And it was an early social media site. It doesn't exist anymore. But at its height, it had 600 members from around the world who were all interested in myth, and they were in different communities. How you're building your own community here, and everybody has their own community. So now, I don't know if there's a clearinghouse. I think there are certain places, that's a bad word, but there are some places that are gathering like a hub of all these other hubs. Yeah. He was interested in that kind of connection. So that was part of the Myth Singer vision. But what he wanted to do with his life was to keep getting us back into the old stories, because there's medicine in the old stories, which I think we'll hear himself say before we end it. But the thing that we're doing now is, it's called the Myth Singer Legacy Project, is carrying forward his music, his myth telling, his teachings. And this book, The Other Within, was originally published 13 years ago. And then it was published again, like, I don't know, 9 years ago. And now it's published in a third edition. And this edition is so beautiful. And I was so proud to be part of all of it. I was not part of the other two books. I was in his life after the first one. I met him because of the first one. I was in his life for the second one, which I had very little to do with. It was like his project. And now it was like, oh, let's give birth to this beautiful new colors, new cover, new parts,
all the things. And I know, just based on how you've spoken about him in the past, I know, like you said, he'd want to make a 4th and 5th edition, because he's always trying to keep up with the current trends and how it relates to the ancient myths, and how we can kind of find, our place in those myths based on what's happening in today's world. So like you said, he'd probably want to do 4, 5, 6 editions.
Hopefully we'll only have to do the 3rd edition because it'll never go out of print. But he most definitely would have added to this edition if he was living. And our conversation today is partly going to be that. you know.
Yes.
And I did just get a text from someone asking, is there a certain place, if people go on YouTube right now to the Magickal Solution, will they find
Yep, right now, the Magickal Solution, you can find it on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitch. They're
Okay.
playing it everywhere.
Okay, great.
So speaking of, kind of kicking off this conversation specifically about this book, I think we should start with listening to Daniel first and taking it from there. So if you guys are patient with me, I am going to try my best to share my screen with you all. And here we
There
go.
he is.
All right, here we go.
Kind of saying that you embody some kind of archetype to the nth degree.
Yeah, I hate that word archetype, but I have to use it. Archetypal is a little bit better.
But other as an archetype is all what
Yeah.
I mean, and that you lived that path, and therefore you had a story to tell about it when your time came.
Right.
Is that fair?
I recognized myself in the mirror of the stories, and only then was.
Oh no!
Oh, I recognized myself.
To me, how to negotiate the.
I recognized myself in the mirror of the stories, and only then did it occur to me how to negotiate my life.
I love it. I'm sorry that the video playback is acting strange. So, that's okay. You guys got a little taste of, what he looked like and how he spoke and, all of his mannerisms. And I think that that's really important. So let's talk about that, because you see yourself in these myths. Does that mean that on the title, The Other Within, is that who he's talking about, himself, the genius of deformity in myth, culture, and psyche?
Oh God,
is that who he's talking about?
No. So let's unpack that, right? So the part of us that has been othered, right? And the part that we other in ourselves. When people talk about healing, often if we've gone through trauma, no matter what kind, and maybe even if we haven't, there's places that we other in ourselves. They're usually the ones that other people othered us, and then we internalize that. Yeah? Is everything okay?
Yeah, the things just started again. I'm like, no.
So, one thing we're going to talk about for your audience that might not know this yet is how Danny was a trickster, and how we have trickster wisdom that we will hopefully get to in this conversation. But the fact that we're having all these little interesting tech things, it's like, oh, let's just welcome in the unknown and the not knowing, and the fact that we're both improvising and that we're with good intention. We're centered, but we're improvising, right? We're jamming. So because how else can we live?
Right?
Right?
Seriously.
All right. So the other is, I'm going to pull out this little thing in here, which says it so well in his words. I didn't know I was going to read this, but it's right here in the very, very beginning of the book. He says, there is another who stands at the margin within society, and at the same time, at the edge of consciousness within each individual. The orphaned part of us that thrills to hearing about the child in a story who's really a great wizard, or any of these different ways that we're really powerful, but it might not look like that to society. Those kinds of stories, right? And yet there's a lot of people, for whatever reason, who live in permanent outsiderhood, and it's done to us. So when we're talking about what's done by white supremacy to people, what's done by ableism with the exclusion of people with different disabilities, seen and unseen, any of these kinds of things that would ascribe you are a permanent outsider, and we are the ones who are in charge or get to have privilege or, whatever. And to give you anything breathing room even would be called an entitlement, like from a government perspective or any of this. That is a lie. Those are lies.
Those are
right?
all lies. Yeah.
Those are all lies.
And even and living in a system that is not catered to you. Was
right.
created for them by them.
So yeah, and I'm hearing Robert Bly's voice in my ear. I heard that lie. This is from a poem. I heard that lie. So we'll bring Robert in too. So he says the undesirable misfit who may be tolerated but is never truly welcome. So he says, yet in this book, as we wander through the forest of myth and the alleyways of empire, we may catch a sense of meaning and value, discovering that which matters most is hidden in the ongoing, perennial, for millennia, human circumstance of otherness. He says, the othering is the problem. The othering makes plants become weeds. Animals become vermin. Ideas become heresy and treason. People become infidel, outcast, misbegotten, wrong, right? Yeah. Or dangerous, or all of these things that are not true, right? Disvalued, not seen. And so he turns to the myths, and he found the stories in his life, right at a time, several different times in his life, where he realized he saw himself, like we just heard him say on that video. I found myself in the mirror of the stories. So the other is about all that and the genius of deformity. He would start his talks by saying, I am not the genius of deformity. It was a joke, but is also a caveat, like you all should know, in case you are looking at me in my very twisted physique, in my power wheelchair, emanating lots of energy from the stage, yet from this small body. And you think, like, in case you ever gawked at a person who had a different body and thought that they were either a hideous cripple or a marvelous angel or a saint, in case you had any of those mindsets, you should know right from the get-go, I am not the genius of deformity. In fact, no one is really a genius. We have genius. We have gifts. We have creativity. We have spiritual gifts. We have leadership gifts. We have knowledge, understanding, intuition, all these things that we have. They don't belong to us, right? Much. They are in us. They come through us. We are the stewards of them. We have a responsibility to them. That's how he understood genius. And deformity is about deforming a body, or about other things that may be twisted and or not appear to be normal. But it's also this idea from a French philosopher named Gaston Bachelard that you break form in order to liberate the imagination. So Danny read those philosophy books. He was very interested in this idea of breaking form. He found that the philosophy of, a broken form, something that is not whole, that has been damaged, is liberating the imagination and liberating possibility. So he ran with that idea, in that it was a self-esteeming idea to think about.
Yeah, it definitely is.
Or somebody who is judged as not having what you're supposed to have, or blah, 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 and think, no. From the margins is really where the liberation is going to come.
Exactly. When we talk about myths, right, people always kind of default to like Joseph Campbell and some of those big shot names in the community. And I hope to see Daniel up there with those names as well, because as I was reading his book, the piece that for me I felt was kind of running through my mind the entire time I was reading, and the entire time I was watching, and the entire time I was listening to you, is this idea of, what are our modern day myths? Like, do we have any? Like, what's going on? Referring to the ancient ones are good for those big archetypal kind of big feelings that are sort of universal across the board. But what about those individual myths that sort of address, socio-political, very like acute problems? And the only thing I could think about were like superhero movies and comic books and video games and things like that. And in instances like that, it's just amazing to see how far we've come, right? Not even 15 years ago, you couldn't find a black Barbie. You couldn't find a superhero who was, Mexican with a cape. You couldn't, like, it just didn't exist. So, to see these things now where children can look up and say, I see myself. You're right. It is the most empowering thing in the whole wide world. And part of me wants to ask, is there not a luxury, but is there a privilege with regards to quote unquote being the norm, not having to worry about seeing yourself on TV because yourself on TV is the default, not worrying about whether or not your body is broken or your mind is broken or your skin doesn't match you don't have to worry about going inward. You don't have to worry about looking through these myths to find these bigger answers to these bigger existential crises because, there's no suffering in that. There's, you know what I mean? Like, I'm wondering if that's partly what he was talking about. Like, can you speak on that?
Well, I think, here we are, and you're a woman of color, and I'm a white woman or a white presenting woman, Jewish woman, right?
Yeah.
And so I am thinking immediately about what does it mean to be an ally as soon as you bring up this whole topic. Yeah. Because you're talking about white privilege or able-bodiedness
too, yeah,
all colors and cultures, any place
and patriarchy. Sorry, ladies.
Well, let's just say in any system or the layered multi-identities or however we talk about intersectionality, which was also only talked about for the last 30 years. And when I was in school, we didn't get to study it because it didn't exist yet in any books, but it's like but we've lived it. We know it. We have more than one identity. So the parts of our identities that are not under attack, right? That are not being othered, that are not being, I think we used this word the other day in our conversation, disenfranchised, which is not a word that I like because it's like, well, what was the big deal to be enfranchised in the first place?
I didn't see it. Where's my money?
But the luxury thing or the privilege thing, the safety perhaps, that's a very, 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 first of all, in the long-term history of life, that is a newer thing. The overlay of imperialism is not the length of human history. It's, and I was heartbroken when I was studying Greek mythology for the first time a couple of years ago to say like, oh man, this is the beginning. This is the beginning of the hellish separation of the, and it was happening in Egypt too. It was happening in other places that slavery was happening, like that there were these things that human beings were doing to each other in a systemic way. Those systemic oppressions, yes, they go back 8, 9, 10,000 years, but not more than that. But human beings go back more
millions. Yeah.
So I think it helps to put it in a little bit of a frame that even though it looks like it's been forever, it's not actually forever. And that's why I can say I think it's precarious. And we're actually at this point where you see people who have that level of privilege holding on tighter and tighter to it if they can't open their hand and heart and say like, oh, wait, I see you. You're a human being. I'm a human being. We're human beings. We're part of the same fabric. We breathe the same air. We drink the same water. We're alive. We have gifts to offer each other, as like, I don't know, not monetary gifts, not some schmancy gifts, but I mean like the gifts of culture, the gifts of love,
creation.
It's the sort of like, and it's not this other lie that we're all the same. I don't see color. That's a lie. I mean, it's just sort of like, what do you mean? I walk into a garden and I see 800 different colors of flowers, and they're in an ecosystem and they are all part of it. Like
Yeah.
human beings are like that to me. And so what would Daniel say about the myth part of this? Well, for one thing, the mythic thing of looking at at these stories and seeing yourself as a hero, it's super important that there are all colors of heroes showing up in those stories. And Joseph Campbell was all about the hero. But Daniel was like, let's not talk only about the hero's journey, because look at all the people that get left out.
Yes.
What spoke to him was that the myths were saving his life, he said, because they let him see that there were other pieces of wisdom, other instructions that were being given in these ancient stories about how one survives not as the hero, not always as the one that wins. There are all these other characters. So he was very interested in characters with different kinds of bodies. He was very interested into the transgressors, the ones that were stealth, the underground, what he was called the rat's way. Like the birds fly up and the rats figure out how to get out by going down under. That there's deep, dark, fertile underground rivers, truth, soil, that the stories come from the earth. These ideas are antithetical. They're completely against the white light, kind of, let's overlay one particular paradigm on everyone. And if everyone doesn't conform, then they're bad. Right. Like, the people
I love
that are suffering. That's all I got to say. Like the people that are holding tight to that thing, that are upholding supremacist attitudes in any way, probably come from a great deal of suffering inside of themselves. Not that I don't have some of that, because I think,
we all do.
I was steeped in this culture. I'm not claiming any kind of purity whatsoever, but those who would take out hatred against others in this kind of way are themselves. They are themselves in a place where they need healing, period. So
I love that you mentioned that, he really liked to focus on the other characters, right? Like, it's so easy to, even as a human being, let alone the myths, but it's so easy as a human being to see yourself as the main character, the center stage, and everything else is just background. Every person that you meet is just like, a side character that has no relevance, and you just kind of move through life. And I can see that with certain groups of people and certain individuals as well. But I feel like what Daniel's saying is like there is a certain amount of awareness that people who are othered have when they are living in this world. Like they might be seen as the backdrop, they might be seen as the monster, they might be seen as the bad guy, they might not be seen at all, but there's an awareness from the part of that othered person that tells a story, and it's a relevant story, and it may just change the whole game. You don't know unless you hear it, right? And a perfect example of this was COVID. And I explained this to you yesterday. COVID wasn't just an eye-opening situation with regards to how we run a political system and how we do our capitalist thing, but it was an eye-opener in the sense that you can do your job at home, and people and it could wait for an email. That meeting could wait for an email, and there were so many people with disabilities who were denied jobs simply because they needed that accommodation to do it from home. Mm-hmm. And COVID showed us they just didn't give a fuck. They just didn't care until it hurt their profits. And now it's like, oh shit, we got to get people working from home because we can't lose this. It's sad for the other to have to kind of let the world see that as an afterthought. But I think it's also empowering in that your disability, your quote unquote deformity, your form being broken is the game changer in such a cataclysmic situation, and in a sense makes you that hero. Although we can go into like how people with disabilities totally did not benefit from this situation at all, but just kind of using that as an example, you know what I mean?
Yeah, you said a lot of different things there.
I did.
I wanna-
I don't
I
know how
wanna-
anyone keeps up with me, honestly.
It's okay. I'm keeping up, I think. I gotta slow it down though, because it's so poignant.
Mm.
It's like, first of all, it's poignant for me to be with you here today on
Ditto.
Daniel's birthday. He would be 71 today. He died at 67. And secondly, one of the things I know we want to talk about is all this paradox. This is what Danny wanted to teach us, to hold paradox, which is what Trickster teaches us to do in the old stories. Yes. So when we're talking about the old stories, we're not only talking about, some knight in shining armor or some of these things that some of the heroes that we're looking at now are becoming more multiracial in the depictions, but they might still be in a Disney movie or whatever.
Right. Or even different abled.
Right. Some of those heroes, those are still from a Western paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Danny was very interested in what he called associative mythology. So he's finding these different figures that aren't normal, not only in European and Celtic tales, but from Siberia, from Sumeria, from Native American, from South American, different indigenous cultures, from Kalimantan in what is Indonesia, like in all of these different parts of the world, Africa, different parts that have the stories that we don't necessarily hear because they weren't popularized to be what we thought of as myths or what we thought of as fairy tales. Why? Because of the same thing. Like if everything is whitewashed, then we don't even know that some of these other cultural realities exist, right? So he's interested in bringing these different voices from different places and then also sometimes telling several stories in a row. And having them talk to each other, because then they'll also be talking to us from many angles.
I love that.
And so that's one thing that I wanted to say about this, like the hero's journey or not. It's not only like the hero, the anti-hero, or these different characters. It's like there are so many voices that are important, that bring wisdom. We have them in our own family lines, right?
Yeah.
But we don't usually get a chance to hear them in this respectful kind of a way. So
because to bow down at your grandmother's knees, it's not a good look. You can't do that for the gram, right? And it's sad. It's sad. It is.
Well, yeah, the honoring of elders is a whole nother conversation we can do.
No, but I love that you brought up this idea of this trickster energy, with regards to Daniel and how he viewed, and I want to pick your brain about quote unquote trickster wisdom. But first, I kind of want to acknowledge the fact that when we look at the trickster, right, especially, the audience that I have, it's a mix of BIPOC and a mix of like spiritual witchy people, right? Mm-hmm. And my witchy people love to talk about being othered, right? The Salem witch trials, the crone at the edge of the woods who everyone in the village is afraid of. And there's something to be said though about these trickster spirits or these images of the other. One of the things that I noticed that they had in common was this ability to be what I call a psychopomp. It's a very popular word in spiritual spaces. And a psychopomp is someone like Hermes or someone like, they're people who, they're energies that can go from one realm to the next.
Mhm.
They can travel. They are the in-betweeners. They often tend to hang out at the crossroads or hang out in the doorways and things like that. Did he notice that with these othered characters? Was there something about them, or was there a commonality about being able to move through spaces either unnoticed or shifted as a different kind of character in order to move through those spaces? Did that ever come up?
Well, yeah, there's different myths where there's shape shifting in them. Like the birth of Taliesin is one that's very, very well known in the Mabinogian, in the Celtic pantheon. There is, it's just like this god that becomes of being the poet, the one with this great wisdom, but first had to go through these different, because of spells, had to go through these different states. So like a grain of wheat or a grain of corn, and then he turns himself into a grain of corn, or the one who's after him turns themselves into a chicken, right? Eats the grain of corn.
To eat it.
There's this whole chase scene. So many tellers can tell it much better than I. I've never attempted to tell it, but so I'm not going to try now. But there's a lot of different transformational ways that some characters are wielding their energies, right? Like,
Yes.
how do you there's these Cinderbiter stories where the teenager or is considered a good for nothing, and they're just like lying on the stove all day. Well, then when the king gets in trouble, or this other army is coming to mess up the village, all of a sudden they've disappeared because they're actually out there vanquishing them with their superpowers, right? But then they come back. So, like there's these different ones. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question exactly.
No, you are. And the reason why I asked it is, there's a word in the BIPOC community that we use a lot called code switching. And also as a neurodivergent, the word that we use is called masking. So it's this idea that in order to survive, we must adjust our posture, our language, our tone, our accent, our hairstyle, the way we move, the things we have to eat. Like there's a role that we have to play to survive in certain circumstances, to get a job interview, or to speak amongst academics and whatnot. But a lot of people don't talk about how that's tricks, like that's based on, at least based on Daniel's that's trickster wisdom, to be able to put on those different
you and I were talking about this the other day.
masks, right? Go out there, engage with, and come back, and be able to take everything off. I think that's pretty cool trickster wisdom.
It is. It's a trickster function. It's sort of like, because you do go home, you have to be able to take the mask off. In order to do that and put the mask on intentionally, the tricky part is when any of us, because Jews assimilate also in different ways, doesn't look always the same as code switching. I had only learned that word last year, but that there was, and you're teaching me about more about the spectrum as far as neurodiversity. I have some dyslexia, but I don't know enough yet about folks on the spectrum too of autism. So I'm really interested in all this language, and so it's like, because the language is coming from the soul of what the thing is. And one of the, maybe I should just scale back and say, Daniel talked about, really the book is about how do we make the space to be ourselves, and to return to wholeness, and to honor the other is the only way to get to wholeness as a society, or as an individual within ourselves. So like what I was starting to say is that I have my own versions of understanding what assimilation looks like, what you do to cover up or fit in, or mask in different situations. And I think we all do it in our own different ways. The tricky part is the identity. Do we start wanting to identify with that thing that we're trying to fit into, or do we get stuck there and take on the mindset of that? So then we're internalizing the negativity of the other that's going against us or our people, and it's killing us because it's like a negativity that then becomes inside, and we act it out at ourselves or others who look like us. That's internalized oppression, like that. That's the danger there.
Yeah.
So
Actually, we were talking about that yesterday with regards to like Black Panther, the movie Black Panther. And, that's a perfect, the anti-hero in that situation was a perfect example of being othered, being outside of this society that he felt he had every right to be in. He's of flesh and blood of those people. And when he returns, he is looked at as a monster. He is looked at as someone who like is shunned. And he just kind of he just gets to a point where he's like, fuck it, then that's who I'm gonna be. And he, goes on his rage and does his thing. And there's a relatability to that. There's a relatability to that in terms of the mythos, in terms of like, really getting to a point where you've been pushed and pushed and pushed so much. You've been called a particular name so much. Why not just reclaim it? Just say, fine, it's my name, that's what I'll be. And if you want me to be a monster, I'm going to be one hell of a monster. Like there's that relatability, but it's so damaging. Like that one part of it is so damaging. And I'm wondering, I'm sure Daniel did not mean that. Like when he was talking about the other, he wasn't speaking like, oh, you identify me as the other, that monster that you see, so I'm going to be that monster for you. That's not what he meant. Is there
we didn't get to that place, and I don't know if we're going to get to it right now with that film clip. So I'll just try to say what it is that because we're not going to try to play it again, I don't think, right? So
I'll try towards the end, definitely, because
anyway,
I would love to play it.
There in that interview, he has this thing where he says, if people are projecting, this is the most important idea.
If you walk away with nothing else from this live, guys, this is the most important idea. Yes, for real. She's not kidding.
People are projecting this. Danny takes a line from William Butler Yeats, the poet, the Irish poet, where he says, being seen through the mirror of malicious eyes. These eyes that are not well-meaning, that look at us, and they are seeing us as messed up, right? Or as too much, or as monster, or as all of these things. If we take that on, that projection on into ourselves, that is super dangerous. It's like to know that what the poem says is we'll take it on until we get confused and we think that the shape that they see is our actual shape, but it isn't. Right. So what he was interested in cracking open here was, how can we not take on that projection, but how can we celebrate and embrace the otherness? The otherness is actually not the monster that someone thinks that I am, or you are, or that character is, or that, we were talking yesterday about how the dangerous perpetrator of violence stereotype is laid onto African heritage men, and to some degree, a lot of men of color have a version of that, right? So that's not who people really are. Right. There may be circumstances in which what you were describing before, you just say, F it, I'm going to act something out, and I'm just going to give up on like the who I really am, or so and so, right? So and so on. But what Daniel's talking about is, how can we see ourselves in the mirror of the stories where the humanity and also the animality, it's like we're part of the animal kingdom, we're kin with all. How can we get back to that by seeing ourselves in the stories, and how can it show us, because we relate to them, we hear the stories. It's not an intellectual thing. The stories come from the earth. The stories are embodied wisdom, or they're meant to be told out loud by the body and heard from other people into their body, and we ingest them like we would ingest air or food, and they're giving us these images and these characters and these circumstances that happen that are out of the ordinary. They're magical, they are liminal, which is what you're talking about, being on the threshold of where's that place where you're about to code switch, but you actually aren't home yet, and you're right in the in between. This is why I brought this image here.
Yes.
So like the neither this nor that. In this case, you had the wilderness, and then you have the civilization. And what about how we live in between, which is where Trickster is teaching us that we can hold this paradox. Oh, I have to go over here and assimilate in order to get this job. And then I go home and I finally take that mask off. Right. And it's like, but
it's holding that paradox
inside ourselves. We're not either or. We have to become both and, otherwise we'll be torn apart.
That's interesting, because that's what you're basically saying, and I love this, is that the other is not the various masks we wear. It is the essence that understands that it has to take on a role in every situation. But even that is apparent. Like those roles, those masks, they wouldn't be there if we didn't have the potential to be that already. That's part of our multifaceted selves.
Yes.
So it's not that, like you were saying yesterday, it's not that you're taking off the mask and then it doesn't exist in you anymore. But it's also not suppressing it either. It's simply moving. It's like shifting from one face to the next. It's the faceless man from GOT, and that shifting that you were talking about, that trickster energy that moves from these spaces, that essence, that otherness that we're talking about, that's the embracing, right? That's the embracing of the other, and being able to be in those liminal spaces and exist in those spaces, which we talked about earlier. Some people just have the privilege of not being in, or the sad story of not being
in. Story of not being in them. And they need it. They desperately need it.
They need it.
But let's not worry about them who right now.
Yeah.
Like they are actually not our focus, right? This is really about
this is about us.
They need to wake up to their own otherness. So it's not that they're not an audience for this book or this work or this wisdom, but they do not need to be centered. It's
right.
like what they need is to be uncentered so that they can actually get the experience that will make them whole, right? They've been centered too long,
Yes.
So, as far as, and I don't want to do the us them, because the us them is us inside too, the pantheon inside of ourselves. So what's the piece I didn't quite say that I want to say about the projection is that Danny talked about, he was very interested in the work of this physicist named David Bohm, and David Bohm taught about quantum physics and the implicate order, this wholeness, that the whole way that we can understand all of the universe from this scientific physicist mindset is what is not seen. It's like we actually see the things that are explicit, they are explainable, they are tangible, they are present, and like something will show the negative space by it being positive space or whatever. Like the things that are invisible because the visible is visible, right? So the implicate is everything we can't see, but it's implied, and we can measure it only by what we can't see. It's very hard to talk about it, right? Well, Danny grabbed hold of this idea immediately, and he took this idea that there's an implicate order. There's an essence of how everything works and is connected to itself. And he was like, what if we look at this in identity? There's an implicate identity. We all have an essence of who we really are. And then we have all these different ways, the masks, the codes,
express it,
assimilation, the costume, And he said, we have to remember that the mask itself is also a story and honor it.
And to honor it.
But this thing about the essence, the place to not be confused, and to not lose ourselves in the midst of genocide, in the midst of horrible oppression, in the midst of all this crap. Like, and also very important, not just that it's enraging, there's a huge amount of heartbreak and grief. I mean, like acres and acres, floodplains of grief also. So how do these stories help us with that? Sometimes, like I'm thinking about the story. I'm going to grab it out of here if I can.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have just a few minutes, right?
No, we're going to go a little over because I totally screwed up the beginning. And I want to try and play this video again for you guys too, because it's well worth it.
All right. I'm going to try to find this.
And again, plug in the book, The Other Within. I will leave a link in the comments at the end of the show.
Oh yeah, and I will say a few things about what's coming up for us as well, but we're not there yet.
Sure.
Let me just God, it's a pleasure to talk with you, and I love that this is this wide-ranging conversation, which it has to be, you know.
It's so vast. There's, again, I feel like I'm gonna because I do want to know on a few of the topics. Right now, we're giving everyone a taste of everything. We talked extra energy. We talked about holding packs. We talked, just a second. Let me get this piece here for you. I'm gonna get. Oh, did you find it? Did you find the thingy?
I have it. Yeah, I have it. I'm just. Yeah, you were fading a little bit. So I'm wondering if when you're trying to play that other video, whether it might be messing up the bandwidth or something. Anyway, he's talking about this. This is a Basuto story from Africa that is called Letualone. And to me, when I thought of it, because we were talking about the grief. So what happens is that there's this great monster, a formless monster, and this being that was born only of a woman and had seen no childhood. It was like a magical birth, and he grows very quickly and he vanquishes the monster. And so that's fantastic. But then the people were not grateful. It's sort of echoing, what you were just saying about the hero not being, or even the anti-hero, not, but then there's no place for them. So
Right.
This is another piece of thing that we can talk about another time, which is when you go on an initiatory experience or one comes to you through an accident or an illness, what we need to be whole and sane is confirmation. We need a community to be able to come back to that can say, I see you. You just went through this. Like we need, otherwise, and I learned this from Martin Shaw, this is where madness comes. If we are just, or what we would now have people talk about gaslighting or whatever, it's just like we're not being seen as real, what we've just gone through. So in the stories, we have these characters to show us, can open our broken hearts up to the fact that, oh, in that story, that person wasn't seen either. Like, oh, I relate to that, Anyway, they decided these people couldn't handle the fact that this being had saved them. They decided that he should be killed. So there's a whole series of ways that they try to kill him. And ultimately, he's a trickster and he's a liminal character. And he, it's like he watches them from the outside of the cave. They're burning up the cave. He's just fluid, and he's we're looking at the more than human here, right? The ones that can move. But in the very end, it says he offered himself in the end, finally, because nothing would stop their deep hatred for him. He offered himself up without resistance and allowed himself to be killed. And it is said that when he died, his heart went out and escaped to become a bird.
Hmm.
And I believe that's from a book that is part of The Hero with an African Face, which is a beautiful book by Clyde Ford, if I'm not mistaken. We can give your readers and watchers a little bunch of links eventually if people
Oh,
want.
yeah.
But what he says, what Ford says is the other within is uncertain terrain for many, and we need someone to guide us through this labyrinth of the unfamiliar.
Mm.
Daniel Deardorff is that guide. Essential reading, you know. Yeah. So I just I wanted to bring that because that's sometimes where you're left at the end of the story, with a place to grieve. What a
Mm.
gift, you know. It's horrible, but then we do what we would call feeding the story. And this I learned from Daniel, and this the Myth Singer Legacy Project is continuing that. After we have a night where we sit around, and we've been doing this virtually, we call it the virtual hearth on Zoom, where we're sitting around the fire and Daniel calls the fire, and then we have one of these old, and he calls it in the old way with flint and steel through and I have a video of him calling what became his last fire. We didn't know it would be his last fire. And then we sit and we listen together in the dark, and we find ourselves in the stories. And then we feed the story afterwards. So we have this conversation in the circle with each other, because we need to hear where each person was, or where they fell asleep, or what really bothered them, or what made them thrilled, or, you know, where they have a question. Like, we need to hear all of it, because this is how people lived for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, is that they carried information through these old stories, and that stories taught us, and the stories morphed as they did over time in the oral tradition, because people were carrying them. No one person wrote them. They're like 10,000-year-old stories that, or more, that no one individual wrote. So that's part of the potency of them. They come from community. Anyway, so that's a little bit of a sidebar, but to me, it's like opening up this place of where the stories, they want us.
Yeah. You know, I as someone, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate. So as someone who also has been othered, you know, especially in the spiritual community, you know, there's this need for in spiritual spaces, as the stories get passed, the traditions get passed, you know, the passed in community, the music, all of that gets passed. But what being a solitary practitioner has kind of taught me, because I was othered, is how to look at these myths and be able to get the same information, but and having, being okay, didn't have the community to do it because I had the story. And now visiting this with entirely different experience that I haven't been through yet, which is experience of the myths in group setting. Can only imagine how phenomenal that is.
Well, maybe you want to come on to an event that we do together, and we can have this conversation and also have that experience. We can talk about it for sure.
That'd be dope.
Yeah. Something that's really poignant for me about what you just said is the community that you were having, or the communion, even as a solo practitioner with the myths, is that the characters and the beings and the images in the myths were the community.
Yeah.
You know, so already you're not alone, because you find this thing that is alive. These are, a lot of times, you know, they get written down, and then, but then they need to get told out loud, and they originally were not written down, you know. They are always meant to be alive, and they get told differently each time. It's said by the wonderful writer about myth and myth teller Sean Kane in his book, The Wisdom of the Myth Tellers. He says, the heart of the hearer is impacted by the heart of the teller, and the heart of the teller is impacted by the heart of the hearer, and it's happening simultaneously, you know. So this loop, you know, I look at it as a like figure eight loop, you know, reciprocity, but it's actually probably more like this, right?
The
It's
paradox,
like we're
making love to the paradox.
mandorla. And so here's the teller, and here's the hearer, and then here's the we together listening to each other in the moment of the story.
Moment. Oh my gosh. Yeah. In the moment. This conversation can go 1,000 more places, and I think that's one of the funny parts about it, with the technology being weird, the conversation just kind of being everywhere, the energy being open and flowy and vibrant. I don't know, I'm here for it. I really am, and I'm hoping that, you know, when we close this conversation, if you don't mind, if the audience doesn't mind, I am going to play the you know, 10 minutes of that video as a closing, you know what I mean? So that way the last words will be from him. But in the meantime, you know, how can people reach you? How can people get involved in whatever projects you might be working on? Tell us all about it.
Well, we've really been responsive on a very intuitive level to what seems to want to happen next. That's something that I learned from Danny, to listen to the songs, but also the stories, because you could prepare a particular story. I watched him do this, and then the story itself did not want to be told that night. A different story come forward, you know, and he's told his stories with drumming. And so he would be playing on a djembe, a conga, another kind of drum. We sometimes made drums here. And he would play while telling. So there was more of an entrancing situation going on with that. So we try to recreate some of that now by having as much of his voice still coming to life in these virtual events. We may try to do some hybrid things coming up. But usually we don't say which story it's going to be in advance, because we're still following that same thing of like, well, what's the story that wants to be told?
Yeah.
And so there have been different events where we also had guest artists with us, like maybe yourself in the future, where we then have a discussion of a particular kind on a particular subject, but we also still start in this manner where we're listening to the story being called in, all of the entities and all of the different people you want to have invited to the story. You know, all of the different entities of the living world, all of the creatures that crawl, that fly, that swim, you know, and then all of the growing ones, all of the rock people, all of the different deities by all the names you might call them, all of the ancestors. You know, it's just like this idea, an ancient story is going to be called and told tonight. So we will be doing more of those this year, usually the last Wednesday of every 3-month cycle. So there'll be 4 of them in the year. And then there'll be these other book events that we're doing that are not that different from this conversation, but also more structured around particular things with guests. And then there's going to be something I call Mythic Morsels that will become more like a blog that starts to maybe even be weekly. Right now I'm thinking it's bi-weekly. I want to be able to sustain it. And then lastly, people have been asking for a book group. So stay tuned, because we're looking at partnering maybe with larger platforms that could host it, and that we would have an unpacking of some of the telling of the tales in the book, the reading out loud, and then of course the audiobook will hopefully be out later this year. And yeah,
all of this is exciting news. It's exciting, and oh, yes, you guys get to know this person, Judith-Kate. Honestly, like, you're a breath of fresh air. It was really joyful getting to know you and getting to know Daniel, and Is there any last words you'd like to give to the audience before I play Daniel's video and do a tribute for his birthday?
Well, I just wonder, even though it's not necessarily uplifting, but to me it's appropriately real. I want to read this one passage from the book, if I could.
Do it.
Because it's so much about everything we're talking about, and also the why. In the great storms of life, Daniel writes, the rose and thistle blossoms of status wither and blow away, revealing that which we cared for least to be constant and faithful to self and soul, to that which matters most. Reinterpreting inferiority as an opening to the real and vital interiority will not put an end to the shaming and oppression, yet perhaps it can inform the style with which one walks this difficult road. It would appear the better course to steer clear of such a hard path. Many will avoid it, others have no choice, and a few will make their way by a blend of compulsion and free will. Blake says improvement makes straight roads, but the crooked roads without improvement are roads of genius. Standing at the crossroads of the crooked and the straight, the formal and the deformed, Lao Tzu, the great Chinese philosopher, proclaims, true straightness looks crooked. The other within takes that crooked and precipitous way which Robert Bly has called the road of ashes. Walking among ashes, one may feel the grief of loss and resentment. If one walks far enough, the ashes are no longer personal. We feel the grief of sacrifice and fidelity. These are the ashes of the bison, of the Black Forest, of Hiroshima, Auschwitz, Tulsa, and Wounded Knee. It is not an inviting or desirable road. It is the left-hand path of departure from the ordinary life. True and crooked. The path descends before us, offering a chance, a priceless and devastating hope. In the words of poet Roque Dalton, love becomes a diamond because it had the chance to become ashes.
Thank you so much. And thank you for coming on my show. Thank you for introducing us to Daniel Deardorff. And to the audience tonight, thank you all for hanging out with us live and those who are watching on replay from all over. And tonight we'll leave you hopefully with the last words of Daniel. And let me just remove this.
And so the stories, not specifically to heal, but because we have a fantasy of healing, which is that the wounds and the scars will be gone and will be just as we were before the affliction ever landed on us, right? But to heal, as I mean it, is to make the wound a source, a generous and generative source of what you have to give and bring into the world. And I think that the stories are, it's like what Robin and I were just talking about, is that we've lost that in modern civilization. in the world of Western culture and civilization, we have really we strive to disconnect from the past and move into the glorious future, right? That's the whole thing. And so in order to find the kind of medicine that can heal that split that really goes right down the center of the human heart, and we're all afflicted with it. In that shadowy side of the heart is where all the myths dwell, and those mythic figures that we look to, that we go, oh, that's me, right? Now I understand why this happened, or why that happened, or why people treated me in such and such a way. Because when I came into the room, I looked like that thing that was in this story. And then you get this incredible thing that happens, because you could say, well, if that's the case, when I come into the room, I might be prepared to
Hey there.
Hi.
Were you guys able to hear him?
Up until a certain point. And then at the very, very end, when he goes, well, when I come into the room, you know, and then it's like, oh, that's going to be a great mystery. We hope people will go and check out our own videos. You can see all of them. If you go to YouTube at Myth Singer Legacy, there are whole collections of Daniel's music, his stories, some more live events that we've had about the book, but primarily a lot of Daniel's archive. We're putting all of it up there. So, and if you scroll through this very long video that has the whole concert in the beginning of it with Martin Shaw and Daniel, and you go to about a minute 40, in the whole thing. You'll end up hearing that interview that we were playing today.
All right. Well, Judith-Kate, thank you so much. Thank you for tonight.
Thank you very, very much. It means a lot to me, and I'm so glad that we've met. And I'm serious about the invitation to do something together that we would host.
I'm down. I am down. And to all you guys out here tonight, make sure you comment, like, share, subscribe. You know what to do. And always remember, this is how we grow. Bye, guys.
Bye.